All right, as regular viewers of this channel know, I split my time between Mexico and Los Angeles. I happened to be in LA for an extended stretch when Trump sent in the National Guard a little over a week ago. And my neighborhood is close enough to downtown that I pretty much spent several nonstop days listening to sirens and helicopter noises through my window. The first thing I ended up writing about this for UnHerd was about it's an article called "Trump is Testing Los Angeles," and it was focused on the authoritarianism and abject absurdity of the administration's rationale for what they were doing, and what I think was actually going on there. So this was the first time any president has taken over and deployed a National Guard in a state over the objections of the governor of that state since Lyndon Johnson sent the Guard to Alabama in 1965 over the objections of segregationist supervillain Governor George Wallace. And about 10 seconds of thought should tell you how radically disanalogous those situations are. Jim Crow is about the maintenance of a bunch of unconstitutional mini police states in different states around the country that terrorized a subset of their citizens into not exercising the democratic rights guaranteed by the national constitution. The ICE raids going on in LA were just an ostentatiously over-the-top display of cruelty, making a big, dumb performative show of maximally inflicting pain and maximally enforcing laws that, remember, these are laws that were treated as a civil infraction until the presidency of one Bill Clinton, who started the transition to the version of immigration enforcement regime that we have now. Overstaying your visa is a crime, sure, but it's a crime the way that, not paying parking tickets is a crime. Like, yeah, it's against the law. You can go to jail for it. But if you're bringing down the fire of the gods to enforce a law like that, I'm pretty sure you've got some agenda other than just laws need to be enforced. We'll get back to that. The primary point that I was making in that UnHerd article was that it's obviously absurd to say that Trump was sending the troops to LA to enforce order. His goal, pretty transparently, was to create the biggest possible spectacle and inspire the maximum possible amount of chaos that he could use to justify going even further. As of Saturday before last, when he made the decision to send in the Guard, these weren't even big protests. All the news coverage consistently estimated the total number of protesters in the hundreds, not even the thousands, the hundreds. And most of them were just protesting. There was scattered rioting going around the edges, and certainly in some cases where masked ICE agents were pulling terrified people out of kitchens or construction sites, their desperate friends and coworkers would try to, there were cases where their desperate friends and coworkers would try to surround the agents and, pelt them with whatever objects came to hand, which frankly, if you can't understand and feel some basic elemental sympathy for why somebody, would do that in that situation, I question whether you're made of human parts. But in any case, I haven't seen a single claim that any of these officers were even seriously injured when someone, chucked an empty can at them or whatever. And you'd really think that if there were any serious injuries, we'd have heard about it and heard about it and heard about it nonstop by now. But no, somehow though, this was a grave enough national emergency to justify sending in the National Guard without state cooperation for the first time since 1965. Trump's Customs and Border Protection Agency tweeted out that anyone who assaults or impedes a federal law enforcement officer or agent in the performance of their duties will be arrested and swiftly prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Attack a cop and lifelong consequences will follow, which, as I pointed out at the time, is a little hard to take from the same administration that did a sweeping pardon of every single January 6th rioter, including ones who attacked cops with bear spray and in some cases even beat them with flagpoles. And more to the point, anyone with two brain cells to rub together for warmth on a cold night knows that the whole thrust of Trump's actions in Los Angeles was to inflame the situation as much as possible. In fact, as of Monday of last week, right, 7 days ago, apparently deciding that, even sending the Guard wasn't enough, really determined to dump out every available can of gasoline he had onto these flames, he sent a battalion of Marines too. At that point, come on, there really is no denying that inflaming tensions is the goal in and of itself. In the article for UnHerd, I speculated a bit about why that might be, and I can see a few reasons. First, most stupidly, but I think this is a real part of the mixture, Trump is a man who loves spectacle for its own sake. This is a guy with a well-documented history of using fake names to call reporters and plant stories about himself during his previous life as a 1980s and 90s business mogul. Sometimes he would even plant like titillating gossip about like affairs in his personal life. He just likes being talked about. Even as the most powerful head of state on the planet, he never quite seems to have shaken the idea that making waves and getting people to talk about him is a goal worth pursuing for its own sake. After the Canadian election in April, for example, when the ruling Liberals went from a near certain loss to an impressive victory by riding a wave of anti-Trump sentiment, Trump just seemed to be delighted that he'd been the center of attention. So that's one thing. And again, I wouldn't completely disregard that. Second, and more substantively, he wants to posture for his base as a tough and decisive leader. His most hardcore supporters believe that the first administration was marred by, the obstruction of all of these, cuck moderate Republicans who took key roles in the first Trump White House. And that's really supposed to, explain all the gaps between what he said he'd do and what he did. After all the hype about building the wall, for example, less than 50 miles of border fencing was actually constructed during his first 4 years in office. And in the summer of 2020, Trump infamously tweeted that, quote, when the looting starts, the shooting starts, unquote. But authorities, thank God, mostly did hold back from shooting. Trump may well want to prove that, he really means business this time around. And if that means responding to unrest that is microscopic by 2020 standards, with a unprecedented show of force, like killing a fly with a rocket-propelled grenade, that's what he's going to do. And both of these would be disturbing in their own way. And of course, certainly, there's this sort of basic absurdity here that, like, even by the time he called in the Marines on Monday, never mind when he called in the Guard on, the previous Saturday, like the amount of just like the actual like scattered rioting and looting that had taken place even by Monday had probably caused less destruction than the riot in my hometown in Michigan when Duke beat MSU in the Final Four in the late 90s, right? Nobody was talking about calling in the National Guard there, and for good reasons. But some of the plausible alternative explanations for why he did this are way more disturbing. Right? He might be hoping that inflaming tensions will provoke a violent response from Angelenos extreme enough to justify seizing, further emergency powers, which if so, again, thank God that doesn't seem to have, played out that way yet. It might also be a trial balloon. Trump could see this as an opportunity to test the limits of how much authoritarianism he can get away with going forward. That would fit the pattern, unfortunately, of a lot of the rest of what he's done in the months since starting his second term. Like, sending deportees to Gulag in El Salvador without trial, or ignoring a judge's explicit order to turn back deportation flights that were already in the air, and just, justifying that refusal with the flimsiest legal pretext of all time. And really, why did he bother doing that? Even within the terms of Trump's demented worldview, it's not like much of anything rested on whether these particular planes made it to their destination. The actual numbers of people involved were pretty tiny. But establishing that the administration could get away with thumbing its nose at the courts, that sounds like a useful precedent going forward for a president with deeply authoritarian impulses. Something similar might apply here. Maybe this time he won't go so far as to invoke the, Insurrection Act. Probably if he was going to do that, he would have done that by now. which although the Insurrection Act would have legalized it, but I know there was at least one incident of Marines taking somebody into custody, which is definitely illegal without invoking the Insurrection Act. And certainly last Tuesday, it was reported that armed National Guardsmen were backing up ICE agents on some of the workplace raids, which again is a very illegal violation of that firewall between the military and domestic law enforcement. But, again, he didn't officially invoke that, so he at least held back from that. But even so, setting the precedent of Marines being sent to sites of domestic unrest might establish a precedent, might make it a little bit easier for people to accept it if next time around he does go even further and officially invoke the Insurrection Act. And to be clear, I'm not claiming that Trump's moves in LA are the opening move in some elaborate and sinister master plan. On the contrary, the man acts on whatever impulses happen to seize hold of his strange childlike mind at any moment, and his moves often backfire. I mean, I think few presidents have been less consistent about following through on their decisions from one week to the next. Administration officials and advisors come and go, Trump's moods change, everybody has to scramble to keep up. I am claiming, though, that as Trump fumbles around in the dark, acting on instinct, many of those instincts are very authoritarian. Poking at restrictions on presidential power, testing how far he could push those limits is par for the course. And so, like I said at the end of the article, the best hope for the health of American democracy is for the public to signal loudly and clearly that enough is enough. It's a pretty basic point, but it's one that I want the people who read UnHerd to hear. I think it's an audience where a lot of people are in denial about the basic situation in that regard. In fact, when my article came out, the front page of UnHerd at that point, when I took this screenshot, mine was in the middle since it was the most recent one to come out. But if you look at the headlines around it, you can spot not one, not two, not three, but 4 articles taking basically pro-Trump views about what was going on in Los Angeles to one extent or another. And to set up the other point I wanted to make about all of this, I want to focus on one of those 4 articles in particular, which was the one by Mary Harrington called America's Philosophical Civil War. So in the article, here's how she describes that philosophical civil war. She writes, one of the prevailing divisions can be crudely summed up, I'm glad she at least says it's crude, although she seems to take it pretty seriously after that, as nationalist versus globalist. That is, on one side, a belief that groups of people are entitled to draw boundaries around an in-group and confer privilege to that group based on internally determined measures of belonging. This is the worldview held by and large by the majority of Americans who support Trump's deportation program. Citizenship means something, and you shouldn't get to be an American citizen with all its perks just by crossing a border and existing in the country for a given period of time. For this group, deporting people in the country illegally is obviously the right course of action. By the way, before going on, that claim about the majority is at least semi-bullshit. All polls show that the country is very deeply divided on this issue. And while a lot of polls do show slight majority approval for Trump, like on the immigration issue in general, a few polls show the opposite. And in any case, every poll shows large majorities opposing at least his most grotesque excesses, like sending people to life in prison in El Salvador without trial, or deporting green card holders for writing newspaper op-eds. And, what she's hyperlinked to there is polls that are just like, oh, do you approve of Trump on immigration in general? And, that'll show a slight majority for yes. And my suspicion is that even a lot of the people who say, yes, I approve of Trump on immigration in general, took it seriously when he said he was going to focus on deporting dangerous criminals. A lot of those people might actually be uncomfortable with pulling desperately terrified fathers and mothers of young children out of hotel kitchens for overstaying their visas. But sure, maybe it is a majority. I still think she's being misleading as hell and not acknowledging how narrow a majority it is at best. But anyway, going on, she writes, against this stand a range of more or less utopian globalists who believe national boundaries are variously arbitrary, cruel, racist, and or fascist, or simply bad for the economy. A cluster of such sentiments, for example, animates a recent Washington Post article lamenting the deportation from wealthy New England Holiday Island Martha's Vineyard of, quote, undocumented workers who form the backbone of the workforce, unquote. The article's hand-wringing over the impact of ICE raids on local pool maintenance and construction projects offers a clue as to the role played by, quote, undocumented workers, unquote, in such elite playgrounds, a fortunate convergence of utopian ideals with economic interest. And look, credit where credit is due. Mary Harrington can craft a well-written paragraph, and she knows how to cherry pick examples that will illustrate the way she wants to portray her opposition. But I want to think a little harder about the more basic claims that she's making here, which are that first, the only people who have any kind of problem with these grotesque ICE raids in LA must be such starry-eyed utopians that they think the very existence of national boundaries is evil and all borders, just need to be immediately abolished. And second, and closer to the heart of my interest, the part about class and economics. So let's start with the first part, because come the fuck up. You obviously don't need to be a border abolitionist to think current immigration restrictions are too restrictive, or people who are already here should be given a path to citizenship instead of pulled out of workplaces by masked feds and locked away from their families. Hell, you could be a complete open border freedom of movement person. You could say that border checks should just be for making sure no one's bringing in guns or drugs or doing human trafficking, but there shouldn't be any restrictions at all on peaceful people moving from place to place. You could even hold that position without thereby objecting to, quote, the existence of national boundaries, unquote. That's an obviously absurd straw man. In fact, for about the first century of the American Republic, there were almost no immigration restrictions. For several decades, literally none. Really, there were, people who were considered hostile or, enemy aliens. There's some restrictions on that, but otherwise, no. Does that mean that the national boundaries of the United States didn't exist during that first century? I have a hard time believing Harrington isn't smarter than that. But like I said, the part that really interests me is the part about the economics of this. That smarmy little line about the fortunate convergence of utopian ideals with economic interests represents a narrative that's become quite widespread in recent years on the pseudo-populist right. And that's what I was pushing back against in the other article I wrote about this last week, the one for Jacobin, which is called Attacks on Undocumented Workers Are Attacks on Unions. In it, I recount a conversation I had with a friend of mine who used to work as an organizer for SEIU and Unite here in Los Angeles. To be clear, he still works as an organizer, but for different unions where this stuff comes up less. Where he told me about the long conversations he used to have sitting in the living rooms of undocumented families, convincing workers there's no way the information they put on a union card would find its way to immigration authorities. These were difficult conversations, but those workers want better wages and conditions and more autonomy and all that stuff as much as any other workers do. And a lot of them went for it. These were successful organizing campaigns. And of course, some undocumented people just get jobs at places that are already unionized. Like I said in the article, it's easy to imagine, it's easy to have this mental image that every undocumented worker in Southern California is a non-unionized day laborer poised at the knife's edge of extreme poverty and willing to accept any wage and working conditions whatsoever. And look, obviously tons of people are going through experiences that, more or less align with that image or at least aren't too far off from it. But with nearly 1 million unauthorized immigrants, on the usual estimate in the greater Los Angeles area, some are inevitably going to land union jobs. Certainly, being real about this, there are tons of unionized hotels and restaurants around the city where a significant percentage of the workforce is undocumented. My organizer friend was also telling me stories that same night about situations that came up at workplaces that had already been organized, where undocumented workers would get fired when their social security numbers came back no match, And the union, would sometimes, end up filing grievances on their behalf. This was like a normal thing that he would do to give them time to sort out their immigration status while they kept their job. And I kept thinking as I was listening that these stories would just be totally incomprehensible to people who've bought this narrative and believe that this section of the working class is just unorganizable. Like I was saying with the Mary Harrington article, a common narrative on parts of the, populist right is that the left and the workers' movement, were supposedly once staunchly anti-immigrant, or certainly at least in favor of ruthless maximalist enforcement of existing immigration laws. And that to the extent that this has changed, this must be a result of woke middle-class identity politics, crowding out the proletarian common sense that had previously prevailed. But that narrative is a severe oversimplification at best and just an outright distortion at worst. What is true, right, this is not wrong, is that some union leaders historically have been suspicious of immigration from lower wage countries on the grounds that this would put downward pressure on wage levels for the native-born working class. That's true. But it's also true that this has mostly been the position of comparatively conservative parts of the labor movement, especially going back to the beginning of the 20th century, the exclusivist craft unions that were affiliated with the old AFL. The leader of the AFL at that time, Samuel Gompers, notoriously supported the Chinese Exclusion Act, right, on these grounds, right, keeping out this competition from cheap labor coming in from abroad. And you can find other examples of labor leaders with similar positions, some of which really surprised some people, like Cesar Chavez, who was actually awful about this stuff. But the other side of the labor history coin is that more radical and militant unions like the IWW at the beginning of the 20th century or the CIO at the Depression era have often taken the opposite position, embracing and organizing hyper-exploited immigrant workers to fight like hell to improve their conditions. There's a story I quoted in the main article from the autobiography of Big Bill Haywood, who was one of the main leaders of the IWW, where he says that in his speech opening the IWW's first national convention in 1905, he turned over in his head how to address the audience. This was just a few decades after the Paris Commune, and the communards had often used the salutation fellow citizens at the beginning of speeches. So he was thinking about doing that. But, quote, there were many workers who were not citizens of the country who were there, so that would not do, unquote. So instead, he said, fellow workers. And honestly, at least within organized labor, the good guys largely did win this debate eventually. The AFL and CIO, of course, merged back together several decades ago. And the current position of the AFL-CIO on immigration, if you look into it, in many ways, in obviously a much softer, more social democratic kind of way, in many ways is more Haywood than Gompers on these issues. And something I said in the article was, okay, one explanation for that might be the sort of populist rights explanation that, the labor movement is gone woke due to middle-class infiltrators or something. But we can arrive at a slightly more plausible explanation if we start by noticing that the issue is never actually immigration or no immigration. The real issue is always what the ground rules are governing how the immigration happens. And that brings us to my favorite insane clip of libertarian economist and comic book villain Milton Friedman, which I included in the Jacobin article. Let's take a look.
Look, for example, at the obvious, immediate, practical case of illegal Mexican immigration. Now, that Mexican immigration over the border is a good thing. It's a good thing for the illegal immigrants. It's a good thing for the United States. It's a good thing for the citizens of the country. But it's only good so long as it's illegal. That's an interesting paradox to think about. Make it legal, and it's no good. Why? Because as long as it's illegal, the people who come in do not qualify for welfare. They don't qualify for Social Security. They don't qualify for all the other myriads of benefits that we pour out from our left pocket into our right pocket. And so as long as they don't qualify, they migrate to jobs. They take jobs that most residents of this country are unwilling to take. They provide employers with workers of a kind they cannot get. They're hard workers, they're good workers, and they are clearly better off.
Got it? In that clip, sounding a bit like the collective id of big capital, Friedman is saying outright that sure, he wants an immigrant workforce, but only one that's maximally economically desperate, terrified, and willing to accept whatever deal they're given. Friedman was clear-eyed enough to understand that it would ruin everything if these workers got rights. And that brings me to the core of the issue, because look, not everything that the pseudo-populist anti-immigration types say is wrong. It really is true that in some sectors, competition from desperate immigrant workers from low-wage countries is used by bosses to get other workers to accept worse deals. That's the correct premise as far as it goes. And we really should find it repulsive when some well-meaning liberal pro-immigration people, sounding oddly like Milton Friedman, talk about how undocumented immigrants do jobs that, quote, Americans don't want to do, unquote. What this really means is that citizens aren't typically desperate enough to do those jobs for such low wages or in such awful conditions. And look, it's not wrong that many such jobs were once done by American citizens who typically got a much better deal. But acknowledging the reality of the problem is compatible with multiple possible solutions. The idea that those of us who want a bigger and more effective labor movement should cheer on Trump's grotesque and anti-human crackdown is a bad joke when we remember the rest of the Trump agenda. Even if we imagine that the whole undocumented workforce would somehow be removed from the country by these crackdowns, why think organized labor would get any benefits from that? The administration has been making an unabashed effort to abolish the National Labor Relations Board, which protects workers from being fired for union activity. It's ripped up the collective bargaining agreements of federal workers. It's pushed for work requirements for Medicaid, which would further reinforce the dependence of workers on their bosses for basic health care. The list goes on and on. So even if we somehow imagine that the administration was successful beyond anyone's wildest dreams in removing undocumented workers, why not think they would also be successful enough in the rest of these goals to neutralize any loss to bosses' bargaining power from the reduction in labor competition? But even forget that for a moment. Imagine some hypothetical version of the Trump administration that actually took the economic populist rhetoric, sometimes thrown around by people like Steve Bannon seriously, and that actually was trying to remove undocumented workers at the same time that it pursued social democratic politics in other areas. Even in this thought experiment, the idea that the immigration half of this would somehow rebound to labor's benefit, or rather the benefit of the part of labor that wasn't being deported, is extremely dubious. Once we acknowledge that the comparative desperation of undocumented workers can be used by bosses in some sectors to drive down wages, there are at least two possible solutions. One is to try to remove the cheap labor competition by expelling all 11 million estimated undocumented immigrants from the country. Good luck with that. The other is to try to make their labor less cheap. This can be done and is being done to some extent on a small scale by the hard work of union organizers like the one I quoted in the article. And it can be facilitated on a national level right in the future by giving these people a path to citizenship so they can come out of the shadows, have far less fear about joining unions, can take their employers to court for labor law violations, when they have to, without worrying that ICE will be waiting outside the courthouse, and on and on. One reason to prefer the second strategy is moral. An immense amount of human suffering is being inflicted on nonviolent and otherwise law-abiding workers and their families as they just try to keep their heads down and live their lives. And they're not the only victims. As we've seen, in the last week and a half in Los Angeles, the mechanics of deportation often rely on pretty blatant racial profiling, especially when, like now, authorities are looking for big splashy gestures to prove that they're ramping things up. And it's not nearly as uncommon as you might think for American citizens to get swept up into immigration detention, where their insistence that they are citizens is sometimes disregarded. There are, cases where, like ICE agents and their jailers have just like, even when people have documents with them, they'll just assume that the documents are fake. People being held in immigration detention do not have the same rights to counsel as Americans accused of other kinds of crimes. And there have been cases of wrongfully detained citizens sitting in them, those detention cells for a long time, right? While waiting to prove that they really are citizens. So that's the moral point. There's a closely related point about union principles here too. I mean, how much credibility would your union have? And this becomes not just a moral issue, but a strategic one, if it stood by and did nothing as its members were kidnapped from their work site by masked federal agents. There's a reason why David Huerta of the California SEIU, for example, has been such a powerful voice for immigration reform. And it's not about identity politics trumping class solidarity, quite the opposite. But there's also just a purely strategic case for the second option. It's not as if there's some button under the desk at the Oval Office that says, push here to remove all 11 million undocumented immigrants. If there were, Trump most certainly would have pushed it during his first term. We could be facing 4 long, miserable years of the kind of grotesqueries that ICE has been carrying out in Los Angeles, happening like every day. And quite likely, most of the undocumented population would not, in fact, be deported. It's not that easy to do this logistically. And the ones who did avoid deportation in that scenario would be that much more terrified of being noticed, that much harder to organize, and that much more vulnerable to hyper-exploitation. Imagine that Trump managed to deport, say, 1 million or 2 million undocumented workers around the country, for example. How much harder would that make, with the remaining population of 9 or 10 million, how much harder would that make those living room conversations about taking the risk of signing a union card? So in fact, we should not find it surprising, right? Contrary to this kind of populist right narrative, we should not find it surprising that so many of these protests in the last week in LA have been organized by unions. If you believe an injury to one is an injury to all, then anti-worker class warfare really does not get much more in your face than masked feds being backed up by armed National Guard soldiers pulling people out of workplaces to dump them in this rights-free black hole of immigration detention. But look, I want organized labor to become the face of resistance to these raids as much as at all possible. Right? I mean, the protests that have happened last week are a good start, but that's all they are. Because a lot of the initial resistance in LA was so diffuse and disorganized that it ended up playing out in a way that is really good for the right. Because a lot of the dynamics of this, right? You have relatively apolitical immigrants, terrified and furious for obvious reasons, reaching for the first symbolic language that comes to hand, which means they often default to symbols of cultural identity, waving Mexican flags or using slogans like "Viva la Raza," which literally means "Long live the race." That's totally understandable, but it's not exactly going to be the basis for a movement that's best positioned to win majority support in a country where this is a minority cultural identity. And being real about this, the combination of this kind of symbolism and the scattered outbreaks of rioting and looting that happened, to a great extent downstream of the Trump administration doing everything that's power to ratchet up tensions, that combination has combined to create really depressingly powerful propaganda for the Trumpist right to use to discredit the protests. Now, not mind you that there have not been plenty of American flags at the protests too, but of course they don't show those on Fox News. I have, however, seen those with my own eyes at protests. The fact is, even in a country where the overall rate of union density is as depressingly low as it is in the United States, the social force best positioned to change these calculations is still going to be organized labor. So while America's structure of repressive labor laws makes unauthorized, like wildcat strikes, risky and difficult, in any situations where you can pull one off, shutting down workplaces where some of the workers, when some of the workers are dragged off by ICE, gives other employers who see that happening a powerful incentive to think twice about cooperating with deportation raids. And the more of this that happens, the more the risk reward calculation for currently unorganized, undocumented workers shifts in the direction of betting on solidarity. Oh, these are the people who are actually willing to stand up for me. Similar points apply to standard tactics of labor resistance, that are often used to get around the legal restrictions on spontaneous strikes, like sick-ins and slowdowns and all of that stuff that you can do, even if you're not willing to roll the dice quite as much as going on a wildcat strike that, would justify firing you. And the more people at any workplace standing around an ICE agent and making it hard for them to quickly go about their business, the more likely it is that any given sweep will fail. And just broadening beyond these tactical specifics, as I would see it, the larger issue is just this. The more people who see this as a labor issue, the better in just about every possible way. The more we can frame the issue not as one ethnic demographic fighting with another, which, if that's how it's framed, the demographic math plays into the hands of the bad guys, but as a universalist question of workers' rights, the better. The more the resistance to Trump's grotesque deportation machine is not a confused teenager standing around a burning car, but a trade unionist talking about how an injury to one is an injury to all, and he won't stand by while his brothers and sisters are taken by ICE, the better. None of this guarantees that the right side will win, but it can give the right side a way better chance. You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.